All right, how we doing, guys? This is David Patrick Carey with Church of the Eternal Logos, and today we're going to be diving into some pre-Socratic philosophy. So before we get going, let me just double check on the audio. Can somebody let me know that we're sounding good? Thumbs up, anything in the chat, that would be appreciated. So I got a ton of content we're going to be going over today. Glad you nerds are wanting to join and ride along today. So we're going to be getting into a ton of different topics. We're going to be going over the Ionian School of Pre-Socratic philosophy. We're going to be diving into Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus, Parmenides, Zeno, Empedocles, Anaxagoras, the Pythagorean school. So we're going to be hitting a ton of different topics today. And what we're going to be reading from is Frederick Copleston's History of Philosophy, Greece and Rome. So I don't know if you guys are familiar, but this is actually, he's a Jesuit, so do with that what you will. But Father Copleston, this is actually a very famous set of philosophy, and this is only volume one, as you can see. And so I'll show you what I have. I have a whole bunch of books. It's a whole series, and it's actually a famous series. So as you can see, tons of different schools of philosophy here. Definitely recommend getting this series if you're interested. It's considered, it has quite a reputation actually, and it's considered one of the better histories of philosophy. So I don't know how many of you guys have ever even dove into some books to go on the history of philosophy, but immediately it becomes very apparent that various authors have an agenda. And so Father Frederick Copleston's series, his 11-part series on the history of philosophy, is considered to be a great resource, and is actually written for seminarians, of course, Catholics. So obviously there's going to be a little bit of contention there if you're Orthodox, but generally speaking, it has a great reputation. I've even heard Dyer refer that he has his own set. So if you guys aren't familiar, that's what we're going to be reading from, and it's a great resource. So before I get into everything, I just kind of want to mention that if you see me going like this is because I actually have a problem with my right eye. I have what's called superior oblique myokymia. And it's one of the muscles on the back of my eyeball actually spasms sometimes. And so when it does that, it spasms, causing my eye then to the perception of what I'm seeing out of my eye, it starts to jitter. And so sometimes when I read, I have to close my right eye. So if you see that, that's what's going on there. But what I've done is gone through here and highlighted what I deem to be the most important sections. So we're going to be covering Father Copleston's entire portion of pre-Socratic philosophy, but we're going to be really just hitting what I see as the main points, the high points. And so, like I said, we're hitting the Ionian School. We're going to be hitting the Pythagorean School. We're going to talk about, well, what's unique there? What is important? What is then going to be developed by Empedocles later on? Or even Anaxagoras, who's going to sort of synthesize a sort of Parmenides and a Parmenidean understanding of being versus some of the ideas of the Pythagoreans. We're going to be getting to Zeno and Zeno's crazy paradoxes and stuff like that. So a lot of content we're going to be going over. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you know anybody who might be interested, send them the link. We'd love for them to join. But before I get into the actual philosophies, I want to go over a quick overview of what we're going to be getting into and why Ionaian School is the beginning school of philosophy. And so I'm just going to be reading a bit of sections here from Father Copleston, and here we're just highlighting that Ionia, where we get the sort of three main figures here in the beginning of pre-Socratic philosophy, is the sort of hearth of philosophy itself, and even as sort of, when we think of ancient Greece, we tend to think of Athens, though at this early period, it's actually Ionia. And so I'm going to read this section real quick, and we're going to skip around, and I'll just I'll just let you guys know where we're at. But the birthplace of Greek philosophy was the seaboard of Asia Minor, and the early Greek philosophers were Ionians. While Greece itself was in a state of comparative chaos or barbarism, consequent on the Dorian invasions of the 11th century BC, which submerged the old Aegean culture, Ionia preserved the spirit of the older civilization. And it was the Ionian world that Homer belonged, and even in the Homeric poems enjoyed the patronage of the new aristocracy. While the Homeric poems cannot indeed be called a philosophical work, though they are, of course, a great value through the revelation of certain stages of the Greek outlook and way of life, while their educational influence on Greeks of later times should not be underestimated, since the isolated philosophical ideas that occur in the poems are very far from being systematized, considerably less so than in the poems of Hesiod, the epic writer of mainland Greece, who portrays in his work his pessimistic view of history, his conviction of the reign of law in the animal world, and his ethical passion for justice among men. It is significant that the greatest poet of Greece and the first beginnings of systematic philosophy both belong to Ionia. And so that's where I wanted to start there, is contextualize where we're at. And I'm going to give a little bit of a map here. So here is a sort of visual graphic of what we're looking at here. We can see we're looking at Ionia, Asia Minor here. And where it says Mileto, that is really going to be the source of a lot of these early philosophers. That's where we're going to be from, the sort of that particular region in Ionia. And so continuing on, I just want to highlight then how it was important for philosophy can't occur until a civilization has sort of reached a level of stability, if you will. And so this is one of the reasons why maybe we see very different developments across regions throughout, world history and stuff like that. But Father Copleston mentions that when social life was settled, men could turn to rational reflection. In the period of philosophy's childhood, it was nature as a whole which first occupied their attention. From the psychological standpoint, this is only what one would expect. Thus, although it is undeniable that Greek philosophy arose among a people whose civilization went back to the prehistoric times of Greece, what we call early Greek philosophy was early only in relation to subsequent Greek philosophy and the flowering of Greek thought and culture on the mainland. In relation to the preceding centuries of Greek development, it may be looked on rather as the fruit of a mature civilization, making the closing period of Ionian greatness on the one hand, and ushering in, on the other hand, the splendor of Hellenic, particularly of Athenian culture. And so that's most of what we think of when we think of ancient Greece. We think of the sort of Hellenic period, we think of Athens, we think of all this stuff. But for our worldview here, it's mostly going to center around Ionia and Asia Minor. In fact, in somebody like Anaxagoras, we're going to find a Persian. We're going to find a Persian that contributes greatly to Greek philosophy. And then eventually we're going to get into the Atomists. So, again, we're talking here about 6th century BC, the Ionaian School. In Ionia, in Mileto, however, it's kind of presented in different ways. It was a sort of mercantile center and cultural hotspot. So that's why it became a sort of breeding place for philosophical thought and inquiry. I mean, well, here, even Father Copleston talks about how it was really a meeting of East and West. And so it must be remembered that Ionia forms, as it were, the meeting place of West and East, so that the question may be raised whether or not Greek philosophy was due to Oriental influence, whether, for instance, it was borrowed from Babylon or Egypt. This view has been maintained but has had to be abandoned. And this is something we hear a lot of, given a sort of syncretic worldview, is that, well, Greek philosophy, it's just a building upon the Egyptians. It's a borrowing from the ancient Mediterranean or whatnot. And I have a section here where we really kind of debunk that. Philosophy itself does not come, it is not Egyptian-based, it is not Babylonian-based, but we could say to a degree that They contributed to mathematics in a very primitive way, because this gets developed much further with the Greeks in regards to the Egyptians. And then astronomy. It's more astrology in Babylon, and then the Greeks turn it into more of an astronomical thing, trying to divorce it from the zodiac and things like that. And so Father Copleston mentions that the Egyptians had a philosophy to communicate has never been shown, and it is out of the question to suppose that the Greek philosophy came from India or from China. But there is a further point to be considered. Greek philosophy was closely bound up with mathematics, and it has been maintained that the Greeks derived their mathematics from Egypt and their astronomy from Babylonia. Now that Greek mathematics were influenced by Egypt and Greek astronomy by Babylon is more than probable. And then skipping a few lines, it says that, but that is not the same as saying that Greek scientific mathematics derived from Egypt or their astronomy from Babylon. Detailed arguments left aside, let it suffice to point out that the Egyptian mathematics consisted of empirical, rough and ready methods of obtaining a practical result. Thus, Egyptian geometry largely consisted of practical methods of marking out afresh the fields after the inundation of the river Nile. Scientific geometry was not developed by them, but it was developed by the Greeks. Similarly, Babylonian astronomy was pursued with a view to divination, sort of magical, theurgic understanding. We've talked about Hermeticism in previous videos and how you can perform these sympathetic relationships. And the Persians were known for their astronomy and their astrology. In fact, even in the biblical narratives, who are the three magi? Where are they from? And how do they find Christ other than astrology, astronomy, however you want to frame that? Similarly, Babylonian astronomy was pursued with a view to divination. It was mainly astrology, but among the Greeks, it became a scientific pursuit. And so, there's just a couple more things I want to highlight before getting into Thales. He's going to be our first philosopher, and this really comes from Aristotle, attributing that Thales is the first philosopher. And so I just want to highlight that. And just ask everybody to please like the video if you guys can. If you haven't, would greatly appreciate that. And so skipping forward, again, we're still kind of contextualizing pre-Socratic philosophy. We're still trying to discuss Ionia, why it was this sort of cultural hearth, why it was the center place, the meeting place between East and West, a mercantile city, and that. This little section right here I found really interesting. And it has to do with a sort of will to power, and how there's a whole section here that was reported by Thucydides, which I guess I can read. We don't have a time constraint here, but really interesting discussion on how Greeks, the sort of ideal Greek would take a sort of Nietzschean Übermensch type of understanding, and that that the idealized man was a sort of will to power, and they valorized that idea. And so here's Father Copleston really trying to get into that understanding. Moreover, although the Greeks certainly had their ideal of moderation, they were constantly being lured away from it by the will to power, the constant fighting of the Greek cities among themselves, even at the heyday of Greek culture, and even when it was to their obvious interest to unite together against a common foe, the constant uprisings within the cities, whether led by an ambitious oligarch or a democratic demagogue, the venality of so many public men in Greek political life, even when the safety and honor of their city was at stake, all manifest the will to power which was so strong in the Greek. And so, since again we don't have a time limit here, I'm just going to go ahead and dive into this story, this little narrative that Copleston's reiterating, but it was actually written down by Thucydides in regards to this sort of infighting within Greece, resentment towards each other at times, and this sort of valorization of the will to power. And it reads that we only have to, and this is regarding the will of power, we only have to read the report that Thucydides gives of the conference between the representatives of Athens and those of Melos. The Athenians declare, quote, "But you and we should say what we really think, and aim only at what is possible, for we both alike know that into the discussion of human affairs, the question of justice only enters where the pressure of necessity is equal, and that the powerful exact what they can, and the weak grant what they must," unquote. Similarly, the celebrated words, quote, "For of the gods we believe, and of men we know, but by a law of their nature, whether they can rule, they will. The law was not made by us, and we are not the first who have acted upon it. We did but inherit it, and shall bequeath it to all time. And we know that you and all mankind, if you were as strong as we are, would do as we do," unquote. We could hardly ask for a more unashamed avowal of the will to power, and Thucydides gives no indication that the disapproved of the Athenian conduct. It is to be recalled that when the Melians eventually had to surrender to the Athenians put to death all those who were of military age, enslaved the women and children, and colonized the island with their own settlers, and all this at the zenith of Athenian splendor and artistic achievement. So I think that portrays a subtle but distinct perspective that I think a lot of people don't think of when they think of Greece and this sort of will to power. Now, from a Christian perspective, I guess we could probably say this is a problem with paganism in general, because it always leads back to a sort of divination of the human, a divination of man, a divination of creation, and therefore it's man who is to become God. And obviously, how you do that is going to be related to your willpower. We see this in Thelema with Aleister Crowley. We see this in Nietzsche, really, right? In that Christianity is a sort of slave mentality, right? A slave morality, this type of thing. So, last thing I want to say before getting into Thales and the first philosopher is this. Change cannot be merely a conduct of opposites. Thoughtful men were convicted that there was something behind these opposites, something that was primary. Discussing the one and the many, right? If we have a multiplicity of representations and emanations of things, well, what is it that unites all these different things? And this is going to be the central question, really, or one of the central questions of pre-Socratic philosophy. It's going to be of how do we reconcile the one and the many? Is there an ultimate primal element? And well, as we'll see with some people, sort of differentiation between reason and senses. This is where this idea actually gets developed. Ionian philosophy and cosmology is therefore mainly an attempt to decide what this primitive element, or Urstoff, and we're going to hear this word a lot, Urstoff. It's just a Greek or German word, I'm sorry, and it's kind of the principle of all things. One philosopher deciding for one element, another for another element. What particular element each philosopher decided was his Urstoff is not so important as the fact that they had in common this idea of unity. The fact of change, of motion, in the Aristotelian sense suggested to them the notion of unity, though, as Aristotle says, they did not explain motion. In fact, we're going to see with Parmenides, with Zeno, with Empedocles, that they actually deny movement. They deny any sort of becoming, and that being is eternal. And we're going to discuss that. We're going to discuss that more. The Ionians differed as to the character of their Urstoff, but they all held it to be material. Thales, plumping for water; Anaximenes for air; Heraclitus for fire. The antitheses between spirit and matter had not yet been grasped, so that although they were de facto materialists, in that they assigned a form of matter as the principle of unity and primitive stuff of all things, they can scarcely be termed materialist in our sense of the word. It is not as though they conceived a clear distinction between spirit and matter and then denied it. They were not fully conscious of the distinction, or at least they did not realize its implications. And so that was the sort of preface, the sort of intro into our discussion today that I wanted to get into. And so now we're going to begin with Thales. And so I'm going to turn off this map and bring in Thales here. Thales. And we're going to talk about Thales. Now, he is from Miletus, Miletos, however you want to pronounce it. And he is considered, according to Aristotle, we consider him to be the first philosopher. And as I've already seen, I think, Nate mentioned it already in the comment section. Everything is water for Thales. Everything is water. But even though we would say, well, that's kind of a dumb idea, this was actually profound because it's the beginning of actually asking the question of the one and the many, and what is it that unites all things. And Thales, the reason why we consider him the first philosopher is because he isn't resorting to any mythological understanding to account for the world. This is the big difference, is that he's actually using a logical, a reasoned progression of thought. Now, we would say, okay, obviously the world isn't, the principal unity of the universe isn't water, but this is sort of a revolution within thought that it's totally divorced from any sort of mythological understanding. And he also, I think, for some, we're going to see that there's actually a debate among the Pre-Socratics between whether the earth is flat or if it's round. And so it seems like this debate still goes on. Anyways, the first thing that I want to talk about Thales, of course, his Urstoff. And as we mentioned, it's water, right? It's water. But I want to say that in the Metaphysics, Aristotle asserts that according to Thales, the earth is superimposed upon water, apparently regarding it as a flat floating disk. But the most important point is that Thales declared the primary stuff of all things to be water. Indeed, that he raised the question of the one at all. Aristotle conjectures that observation may have led Thales to the conclusion, quote, getting the notion perhaps from seeing that the nutriment of all things is moist, and that heat itself is generated from the moist and kept alive by it, and that from which they come to be as a principle of all things. Another statement attributed to Thales by Aristotle, that all things are full of gods, and that the magnet as a soul, because it moves iron, cannot be interpreted with certainty. The only certain and the only really important point about Thales' doctrine is that he conceived things as varying from one primary and ultimate element. That he assigns water as this element is the distinguishing historical characteristic, so to speak, but he earns his place as the first Greek philosopher from the fact that he conceives the notion of unity in difference, even if he does not isolate the notion on the logical plane, and while holding fast to the idea of unity, endeavors to account for the evident diversity of the many. And so we're going to see today attempts to reconcile this diversity of the many, one of which will be the logos. So we're going to see the logos being developed and introduced by Heraclitus, although this idea is believed to already existed, but he posits it as a sort of unifier of all these different differentiated characteristics of the world. But we're also going to see nous. Nous comes in with Anaxagoras, and so Anaxagoras, he develops the whole idea of nous, nothing like how Orthodoxy understands nous. So I want to make that for front and center, but that he talks about mind for the first time. Now, I have a great quote from Socrates that's actually highly disappointed with his understanding of mind, but he is the first to really talk about a sort of a mind as being preeminent, and talking about the one and the many, and the mind being the sort of force behind nature. So we can see how that idea is certainly going to get going with Plato, with his divine mind, forms, all this stuff. So, so the last thing, again, Thales. What's important with Thales is that he's the first philosopher. He's the first to say that. He's the first to say that, well, there's one principal element for everything. Of course, he hasn't actually identified elements yet. This is going to come with Empedocles here in a few. But he's trying to account for the one and the many. And this is the beginning of philosophy. And so the last thing I want to say with Thales is, it is indeed possible that the remark concerning the magnet being alive, attributed by Aristotle to Thales, represents the leering on of a primitive animism, in which the concept of the anima phantasma, the shadowy double of a man that is perceived in dreams, came to be extended to subhuman organic life and even to those forces in the inorganic world. But even if this is so, it is but a relic, since in Thales we see clearly the transition from myth to science and philosophy, and he retains his traditional character as an initiator of Greek philosophy. And so this leads us to Anaximander, Anaximander, and he is also from Miletus. He's actually, Thales was his teacher, he was his instructor, and it's believed he's the first philosopher to actually write things down. I found this really interesting, is that he's believed to be the first person to actually write things down, because as we know, Greek had a sort of oral tradition. He believed that nature is ruled by laws. This was actually really important. This was a novel idea at the time, and because he was maintaining that nature must be ruled in a similar mechanism in which societies or cities were maintained and organized and structured. So if cities have laws and laws maintain order, well, then nature must have laws. And so that's actually a fairly novel idea. And so his Urstoff, interesting though, he was obviously a student of Thales. Thales just said everything is water, as we'll see with Anaximenes, that it is all air. We'll see with Heraclitus it's all fire. But Anaximander says that it's actually indeterminate, and that he was against the sort of oppositional idea that Thales proposed. So he was not oppositional, and he also believed in a multiplicity of worlds, and he actually believed in what we would see as a sort of the seeds of evolution, of humans being higher developments of animals. And so let me change this real quick, just so when people come on, they know who we're talking about. Anaximander. Anaximander. Bam. Okay. All right. And so now what I want to talk about him, first thing I want to say is that he sought, like Thales, for the primary and ultimate element of all things, but he decided it could not be any one particular kind of matter, such as water, since water, or the moist, was itself of the opposites, the conflicts and encroachments of which he had to be explained. If change, birth and death, growth and decay are due to conflict, to the encroachment of one element at the expense of another, then on the supposition that everything is in reality water, it is hard to see why the other elements have not long ago been absorbed into water. Anaximander therefore arrived at the idea that primary element, the Urstoff, is indeterminate. It is more primitive than the opposites, being that out of which they come and that into which they pass away. So you see how he's actually trying to get away from a sort of dialectical tension, though that's going to be moved back to, and we'll see Heraclitus try to get out of the sort of dialectical tension with the logos, where he posits the logos as being the unifier. But moving on with Anaximander, he says, it is neither water nor any other of the so-called elements, but a nature different from them and infinite, from which arise all the heavens and worlds within them. Now again, he posited a multi-world theory. And so there is a plurality of coexistent worlds which are innumerable. Each is perishable, but there seems to be an unlimited number of them in existence. At the same time, the worlds coming into being through eternal motion. Quote, and in addition, there was an eternal motion in which the heavens came to be, unquote. This eternal motion seems to have been an apokrisis, or separating off, a sort of sifting in a sieve, as we find in the Pythagorean doctrine represented in the Timaeus of Plato. And so skipping forward a bit, it says, life comes from the sea. So this is sort of his idea of evolution. So you can already see, that's what I found so amazing by when we get into the sort of pre-Socratics, is we see so many ideas that are actually still prominent. We're going to get into the Atomists, so we're going to see the beginnings of a sort of atomic materialist philosophy. Right here, we're seeing the sort of developments of an evolutionary idea of man evolving from animals, all based on sort of secular, paganistic ideas, eternal understandings of matter and being. Life comes from the sea, and by means of adaptation to environment, the present forms of animals were evolved. Anaximander makes a clear guess as to the origin of man. He further says that in the beginning, man was born from animals of another species. For while other animals quickly find nourishment for themselves, man alone needs a lengthy period of suckling, so that had he been originally as he is now, he could have never survived. And so, interesting that he says, based on the sort of the frailty of the human species, especially in early development, that there's no way that they could have survived like the other animals, but must have derived from them. So very interesting stuff there. The doctrine of Anaximander shows an advance then on that of Thales. He proceeds beyond the assignation of any one determinate element as primary to the conception of the indeterminate infinite. So it's indeterminate and it's infinite, out of which all things come. Moreover, he makes some attempt at least to answer the question of how the world developed out of this primary element. And so that's going to really be the sort of unique characteristics of him. And I forgot to include his dates. That was 610 to 546. 610 to 546. I wanted to include, give you guys a heads up on everybody's dates, just so you can kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And so now we're going to go to Anaximenes. Anaximenes. All right. Okay. And so now we're on Anaximenes, and he's also going to have an Urstoff like Thales, but he's going to have air as opposed to water. And so he is the third philosopher of the Milesian school. Again, Melito, however you want to understand that, as we were showing earlier with the graph of Ionia. But he's considered the third big Ionian philosopher in the pre-Socratic period. The doctrine of Anaximenes appears at first sight, at any rate, to be a decided retrogression from the stage reached by Anaximander. For Anaximenes, abandoning the theory of Thales is, the theory of two apeiron follows Thales in assigning a determinate element as the Urstoff. This determinate element is not water, but air. This may have been suggested to him by the fact of breathing, for man lives so long as he breathes, and it might easily appear that air is the principle of life. In fact, Anaximenes draws a parallel between man and nature in general. Quote, just as our soul, being air, holds us together, so do breath and air encompass the whole world. So we see how he's trying to take air and sort of re-understand all this stuff. In order to explain how concrete objects are formed from the primitive element, he introduces the notions of condensation and rarefaction. Air in itself is invisible, but it becomes visible in the process of condensation and rarefaction, becoming fire as it is dilated or rarefied, wind, cloud, water, earth, and finally stones as it is condensed. And indeed, this notion of condensation and rarefaction suggests another reason why Anaximenes fixed on air as the primary element. He thought that when air becomes rarefied, it becomes warmer and so tends to fire, while when it becomes condensed, it grows colder and tends towards the solid. The important point in his doctrine, however, may be said to be his attempt to found all quality on quantity, for that is what his theory of condensation and rarefaction amounts to in modern terminology. And so some of the things that I wanted to say about him is a sort of material monism. So we see, again, building on Thales, we see a sort of material monism. And and really this sort of this going back and forth on the Urstoff. So we see the one and the many, this really important question being posed by the Pre-Socratics. The Ionian School is trying to develop, okay, well, it must be water by Thales. Nope. Then Anaximander says, really, it can't be any of those things. Can't be water, can't be fire, can't be air, because they're oppositional, and therefore it must be indeterminate and it must be infinite. Well, then the next guy, Anaximenes, says, no, it's not indeterminate. It's actually air, and he gets this from observing the breath and things like that. Now, we see that they're developing ideas not based on mythology, but based on sort of sense perception. And this is actually what will become more addressed specifically by some of these later philosophers. Now, the other school of thought, so we had the Ionian school that I just mentioned. The other school of thought, of course, you guys are going to know of, and that's the Pythagorean school. And so they're going to have a whole list of things that are going to be unique to them. So their understandings of sort of what we would consider vegetarianism, the transmigration of souls, which will be developed by some of the later Pre-Socratics. Some will pick that up, some will reject it. Pythagoras himself was an Ionian philosopher. Now, his school is developed later in a different location, but Iamblichus calls Pythagoras, calls him a divine individual. I mean, so Pythagoras had this immense reputation, again, from his school, but it's really hard to differentiate what was Pythagoras's ideas versus what his school developed. And so even as Father Copleston will highlight, it's very hard to know which is which. So it's much easier to just say the Pythagorean school than to specify any single idea to Pythagoras himself. And so his life and his school is a bit shrouded in obscurity. So it's really hard to tell with him. But reading Father Copleston, he says, towards the end of the Ionian civilization, there took place a religious revival, attempting to supply genuine religious elements which were catered for neither the Olympian mythology nor of the Milesian cosmology. Just as in the Roman Empire, a society verging towards its decline, its pristine vigor and freshness lost, we see a movement to skepticism on the one hand and to mystery religions on the other hand, so that the close of the rich and commercial Ionian civilization, we find the same tendencies. Oh, I need to change all this stuff. Let's go over here to Pythagoras. Okay. So, quick thing that I wanted to mention here with the thumbnail too. We see Pythagoras here. This is the famous depiction by Raphael. You see how he's writing in the book here? Look in front of him. We see a depiction of the lyre. So this is highlighting that the Pythagorean school really emphasized the relationship between mathematics and music. And then below the lyre, we see the Tetractys. And so I actually have that here. I'll show it here in a second. Let me continue with Father Copleston. The Pythagorean society represents the spirit of this religious revival, which it combined with a strongly marked scientific spirit. This latter, of course, being the factor which justifies the inclusion of the Pythagoreans in a history of philosophy. There is certainly common ground between Orphism and Pythagoreanism, though it is not altogether easy to determine the precise relations of the one to the other and the degree of influence that the teaching of the Orphic sect may have had on the Pythagoreans. In Orphism, we certainly find an organization in communities bound together by initiation and fidelity to a common way of life, as also the doctrine of the transmigration of souls, a doctrine conspicuous in Pythagorean teaching. And it is hard to think that Pythagoras was uninfluenced by the Orphic beliefs and practices, even if it is with Delos that Pythagoras is to be connected rather than with the Thracian Dionysian religion. And so, moving on then, because there's so much that I actually have highlighted here for the Pythagorean school. The Pythagoreans did, however, obtain political control in Croton and other cities in Magna Graecia. And Polybius tells us that their lodges were burnt down and they themselves subjected to persecution, perhaps at about 440 to 430 BC. 440 to 430 BC, though this fact does not necessarily mean that they were an essentially political rather than a religious society. And so that's the first thing that you really want to highlight, is that the Pythagorean school was religious as it was much scientific, mathematical, philosophical. And so there's a lot going on with the Pythagorean school that maybe we weren't seeing as much of in the Ionian school before. And these are going to be, we're going to see that their ideas are essentially going to begin to compete with each other. As the religious ascetic ideas and practices of the Pythagoreans, these centered around the idea of purity and purification, and the doctrine of transmigration of souls, naturally leading to the promotion of soul culture. Soul culture. The practice of silence, the influence of music, and the study of mathematics were all looked on as valuable aids in tending the soul. Yet some of their practices were of a purely external character. For example, to abstain from beans, not to walk in the main street, not to stand upon the parings of your nails, to efface the traces of a pot in the ashes, not to sit down on a bushel, etc. And if this were all that the Pythagorean doctrines contained, they might be of interest to the historian of religion, but would hardly merit serious attention from the historian of philosophy. However, these external rules and observances by no means comprise all that the Pythagoreans had to offer. And so, moving forward, in his Life of Pythagoras, Diogenes tells us of a poem of Xenophanes, in which the latter relates how Pythagoras, seeing somebody beating a dog, told him to stop, since he had recognized the voice of a friend in the yelping of a dog. I had never heard that before, but thought it was pretty interesting that Pythagoras recognized an old buddy, I guess, in the yelping of this particular dog. I thought it was interesting. So, whether the tale be true or not, we don't know. The ascription to Pythagoras of the doctrine of metempsychosis may be accepted. This is just another term for sort of reincarnation, transmigration of souls. The religious revival had brought to fresh life the old idea of the power of the soul and its continued vigor after death, a contrast to the Homeric conception of the gibbering shades of the departed. So we see a new understanding of life and death. We see a blending of religion and philosophy due to the fall of the sort of Ionian civilization, and we see a religious revival in the Pythagorean school. The theory of the soul as the harmony of the body, which is proposed by Simmias in Plato's Phaedo and attacked by Plato, would hardly fit in with the Pythagorean view of the soul as immortal and as undergoing transmigration. So the ascription of this view to the Pythagoreans is at least doubtful. Now, Orphism was connected with the worship of Dionysius, a worship that came to Greece from Thrace and Scythia, and was alien to the spirit of the Olympian cult, even if its enthusiastic and ecstatic character found an echo in the soul of the Greek. But it is not the enthusiastic character of the Dionysian religion which connects Orphism with Pythagoreanism. Rather, it is the fact that the Orphic initiates who, be it noted, were organized in communities, were taught the doctrine of the transmigration of souls, so that for them it is the soul and not the imprisoning body which is the important part of man. In fact, the soul is the, quote, real, unquote, man, and is not the mere shadow image of the body as it appears in Homer. Hence the importance of soul training and soul purification, which included the observance of such precepts as avoidance of flesh meat. Orphism was indeed a religion rather than a philosophy, though it tends towards pantheism, as may be seen from the famous fragment And this is a long thing on Zeus. But insofar as it can be called a philosophy, it was a way of life and not mere cosmological speculation. And in this respect, Pythagoreanism was certainly an inheritor of the Orphic spirit, again, because it was a religious revival as much as a philosophical school. Aristotle tells us in the Metaphysics that the Pythagoreans, as they are called, devoted themselves to mathematics, and they were the first to advance this study, and having been brought up in it, they thought its principles were the principles of all things. And so, again, we were talking about Urstoffs, we're talking about the water of Thales, the air of Anaximenes, and now we're getting the numbers of the Pythagorean schools. Another sort of Urstoff, the sort of principle of everything, of how all this connects. And so, all things are numerable, and we can express many things numerically. Thus, the relation between two related things may be expressed according to numerical proportion. Order between a number and ordered subjects may be numerically expressed. But what seems to have struck them particularly was the discovery that the musical intervals between the notes on the lyre may be expressed numerically. Pitch may be said to depend on number, insofar as it depends on the lengths, and the intervals on the scale may be expressed in numerical ratios. The Milesian cosmologists spoke of a conflict of opposites in the universe, and the musical investigations of the Pythagoreans may easily have suggested to them the idea of a solution to the problem of the conflict through the concept of number. Aristotle says, quote, "Since they saw that the attributes and the ratios of the musical scales were expressible in numbers, since then all other things seemed in their whole nature to be modeled after numbers, and numbers seemed to be the first things in the whole of nature, and the whole heaven to be a musical scale and a number." Now, Anaximander had produced everything from the unlimited and indeterminate, and the Pythagoreans combined with the notion that of the limit to the peiros, which gives form to the unlimited. This is exemplified in music, in health too, where the limit is in tempering, which results in the harmony that is health, in which proportion and harmony are arithmetically expressible, transferring this to the world at large. And the Pythagoreans spoke of a cosmological harmony, but not content with stressing the important part played by numbers in the universe, they went further and declared that all things are numbers. And so what's really interesting we're going to see is it's more than just everything. It's more than gematria. It's more than everything. When we say everything can be reduced to numbers, they literally believe numbers represented like solid bodies. And so I don't know if I highlighted it, but there's one point where they're talking about how the number 5 represents marriage, because 2 is a feminine number, 3 is the first masculine number, and the addition between the first feminine and the first masculine is 5, and therefore 5 is the number of marriage. And they have a whole worldview based on numbers that it's really hard to conceptualize. Now, Aristotle tells us that the Pythagoreans hold that the elements of number are the even and the odd, and that the former is unlimited and the latter limited. And I proceed, and the I, or the one, proceeds from both of these, for it is both even and odd, and the number of the I and the whole heaven has been said is numbers. Whatever precise period of Pythagorean development Aristotle may be referring to, and whatever be the precise interpretation to be put on his remarks concerning the even and the odd, it seems clear that the Pythagoreans regarded numbers spatially. 1 is the point, 2 is the line, 3 is the surface, 4 is the solid. To say then that all things are numbers would mean that all bodies consist of points or units in space, which then taken together constitute a number. And that's kind of what I was trying to highlight, is that, 1 is a point, 2 is a segment, and so on. This whole thing, it gets developed even further if you. That's why I recommend getting this History of Philosophy series. It's actually really good. But you need some of these visual depictions to kind of be illustrated what exactly they're saying with some of these ideas regarding numbers. So I'm going to skip that portion, given that you guys aren't going to have the same representations. But I do want to show you guys this right here. This little shindig right here is that is called the Tetractys, and we see how it has 10 dots here, and they use this shape in incredible ways to try to get new understandings of how numbers work, how male and female works, how all these different things connect to each other. And so I recommend actually looking into this idea. Not that I'm saying that it's true or it's something that you need to really hold on to, but it's interesting nonetheless. I did a bit of my own investigations into it for this video, and I thought it was pretty interesting. But continuing on then, regarding the Pythagorean school, it says that they transferred their mathematical conceptions to the order of material reality. Thus, by juxtaposition of several points, a line is generated, not merely in the scientific imagination of the mathematician, but in external reality also. In the same way, the surface is generated by the juxtaposition of several lines. And finally, the body by the combination of several surfaces. Points, lines, and surfaces are therefore the real units which compose all bodies in nature, and in this sense, all bodies must be regarded as numbers. In fact, every material body is an expression of the number 4, since it results as a fourth term from the three constituent elements, points, lines, and surfaces. And so, again, very different understanding of elements than we'll see with Empedocles, who develops fire, water, air, and earth. But moving on, yet if objects are regarded, as the Pythagoreans apparently regarded them, as sums of mathematical quantitative points, and if at the same time numbers are regarded geometrically as sums of points, it is easy to see how the further step, that of identifying objects with numbers, could be taken. To the Pythagoreans, not only was the earth spherical, so we see a departure from the Ionian school, who believed the earth was a disk. They believed it was flat. The Pythagoreans believed that the earth was spherical, but it is not the center of the universe. The earth and the planets revolve along with the sun, so it's not like they revolve around the sun, but they revolve around a central fire or hearth of the universe, which is identified with the number 1. The whole world inhales air from this boundless mass outside it, and the air is spoken of as unlimited. The Pythagoreans are of interest to us, not only because of their musical and mathematical investigations, not only because of their character as a religious society, not only because through their doctrine of transmigration of souls and their mathematical metaphysic, at least insofar as they did not materialize numbers. They tended to break away from the de facto materialism of the Milesian cosmologists, the Ionian School, but also because of their influence on Plato, who was doubtless influenced by their conception of the soul. He probably borrowed from them the doctrine of the tripartite nature of the soul and its destiny. The Pythagoreans were certainly impressed by the importance of the soul and its right tendence, and this was of the most cherished convictions of Plato, to which he clung all his life. Plato was also strongly influenced by the mathematical speculations of the Pythagoreans, even if it is difficult to determine the precise extent of his debt to them in this respect. And to say of the Pythagoreans that they were one of the determining influence in the formation of thought of Plato is to pay them no mean tribute. So that concludes our section of the Pythagorean school. Again, this video is just an intro, so I apologize if you guys are wanting to get a little bit deeper into the specifics of some of these schools. Certainly there's works out there in which you can do that. This video is really just a point to really condense and highlight the most important points of pre-Socratic philosophy so you guys can kind of know what's going on here. And so now we're going to switch over to a gentleman that I'm quite fond of. in regards to the Pre-Socratics at least, is Heraclitus. And so let me shrink his photo a bit here. There we go. And so now we're going to be dealing with Heraclitus. Now, Heraclitus, we've already talked about in previous videos in regards to the development of logos theology, right? Because Heraclitus is famous for the use of logos and trying to answer the question of the one and the many with the idea of logos, the unifier of opposites. So he's actually pushing against Thales and the sort of oppositional understanding of these elements as a sort of in an attempt to answer the sort of one and the many. And so Heraclitus also, he's famous for Pythagoreans, the all flows, the idea that you don't step in the same river twice. And so this idea is going to be refuted in our next philosopher, Parmenides, because Parmenides absolutely rejects the idea of becoming. So this is what Heraclitus is known for, the logos, and then his insistence that everything is changing, therefore everything is becoming. Nothing will last. Now, interestingly, Heraclitus' dates 535 to 475. As I mentioned in our Logos Theology video series, Heraclitus is actually from Ephesus. So that is, of course, the same city in which John the theologian, the author of the Gospel of John, where he writes his books. So he's also in Ephesus. We have, the book of Ephesians, or the letter to Ephesians. So he was referred to as the obscure. He was referred to as the weeping philosopher. Heraclitus was a very interesting guy. He was considered very odd. I guess he didn't get along with a lot of people. And he posits, so he does fall victim to this sort of Urstoff, this single element. What the single element that unifies all things? Now, I said it was the logos, but then he identifies the logos as fire itself. And so he kind of falls victim to this Urstoff thing. But what I want to say here is that regarding Heraclitus, is that Heraclitus expresses his opinion of Homer in the saying, quote, Homer should be turned out of the list and whipped. Similarly, he observed, the learning of many things does not teach understanding. Otherwise, it would have taught Hesiod and Pythagoras, and again, Xenophanes, oh my gosh, and Hectaeus. As for Pythagoras, he practiced scientific inquiry beyond all other men, and making a selection of these things, claimed for his own wisdom that was but a knowledge of many things and an imposture. Many of Heraclitus' sayings are pithy and pungent in character, if somewhat amusing on occasion. For example, physicians who cut, burn, stab, and rack the sick demand a fee for which they do not deserve to get, unquote. Another quote, man is called a baby by God, even as a child by man, unquote. Another quote, asses prefer straw to gold. I think that's hilarious, unquote. Another quote, man's character is his fate, unquote. I think that's actually a really interesting kind of word of wisdom there. Man's character is his fate. In regard to Heraclitus' attitude to religion, he had little respect for the mysteries, and even declares that the mysteries practiced among men are unholy mysteries. Moreover, his attitude towards God was pantheistic in spite of the religious language he employed. This is him describing nature. Nature loves to hide, unquote. Another saying of his is, the Lord whose is the oracle by Delphi neither utters not hides its meaning, but shows it by a sign, unquote. And of his own message to mankind, he says, men are unable to understand it when they hear it for the first time, as before they have heard it at all, unquote. Heraclitus is known to many for the famous saying attributed to him through apparently not his own, all things are in a state of flux, panthere. Indeed, this is all that many people know about him. this statement does not represent the kernel of his philosophical thought, though it does indeed represent an important aspect of his doctrine. Is he not responsible for the saying, quote, "You cannot step twice in the same river, for fresh waters are ever flowing in upon you," unquote? Moreover, Plato remarks that Heraclitus says somewhere that all things pass and naught abides, and comparing things to the current of a river, he says you cannot step into the same river twice. And Aristotle describes Heraclitus' doctrine as affirming that, quote, "all things are in motion, nothing steadfastly is," unquote. In this respect, Heraclitus is a perendello in the ancient world, crying out that nothing is stable, nothing abides, proclaiming the unreality of reality. And so, no, Heraclitus' original contribution to philosophy is to be found elsewhere. It consists in the conception of unity in diversity, difference in unity. In the philosophy of Anaximander, as we have seen, the opposites are regarded as encroaching on one another, and then as paying in turn the penalty for this act of injustice. Anaximander regards the war of the opposites as something disorderly, something that ought not be, something that mars the purity of the one. Heraclitus, however, does not adopt this point of view. For him, the conflict of opposites, so far as from being a blot on the unity of the one, is essential to the being of the one. In fact, the one only exists in the tension of opposites. This tension is essential in the unity of the one. And of course, this one is the logos. This is the word in which he uses to describe it. So that reality is one for Heraclitus is shown clearly enough by his saying, quote, "It is wise to hearken, not to me, but to my," what would be logos, but to my word, to my logos, and to confess that all things are one. Now, this is moving down the page. Again, Heraclitus says positively, "Men do not know what it is at variance agrees with itself. It is an attunement of opposite tensions, like that of the bow and the lyre." For Heraclitus, then, reality is one, but it is many at the same time, and that not merely accidentally, but essentially. It is essential to the being and existence of that one that it should be one and many at the same time, that it should be identity in diversity. For Heraclitus, as the Stoics of later times who borrowed the notion from him, the essence of all things is fire. Again, the Urstoff, right? We saw this in the Ionian School. Now, it might seem at first sight that Heraclitus is merely ringing the changes of the old Ionian theme, as though, because Thales made reality to be water and Anaximenes air, Heraclitus simply, in order to find something different from his predecessors, fixed on fire. Naturally, the wish to find a different Urstoff may have operated to a certain extent, but there is something more in his choice of fire than that. He had a positive reason, and a very good reason, for fixing on fire, a reason bound up with the central thought of his philosophy. Since experience tells us that fire lives by feeding, by consuming, and transforming into itself heterogeneous matter, springing up, as it were, from a multitude of objects, it changes them into itself, and without this supply of material, it would die down and cease to exist. The very existence of fire depends on this, quote, strife and tension. This is, of course, a sensual symbolism of a genuine philosophical notion, but it clearly bears a relation to that notion that water and air will not easily bear. Thus, Heraclitus' choice of fire as the essential nature of reality was not due simply to arbitrary caprice on his part, nor merely to the desire for novelty, to the necessity of differing from his predecessors, but was suggested by his main philosophical thought. Fire, he says, is want and surfeit. It is, in other words, all things that are, but it is these things in a constant state of tension or strife, and of consuming, of kindling, and of going out. So we kind of see his logic there for fire, choosing fire. Now, we're going to start moving into a fuller conception of his understanding of logos. And this is what I think it's, some of this pre-Socratic philosophy is so interesting, because now we can see logos being developed. Of course, nothing like our Christian understanding of logos, anything like that. But in Anaxagoras, we see a development of nous. Now, again, nothing like even Plato's nous or something like that in later Greek philosophy. We're not even going to see that. And it's definitely not going to be the nous of Orthodox Christianity. But we see these ideas introduced into the discussion. And so we'll get to that later. But here's Heraclitus moving forward. The one, again, he's talking about the one that unifies all things. And the one is the logos. And we're going to get to the logos here in a second. The one, in short, is its differences, and the differences are themselves one. They are different aspects of the one. Neither of the aspects, neither the upward nor the downward path can cease. In fact, it's a famous quote of Heraclitus saying that the pathway up and the pathway down are one and the same, talking about how the logos unifies all things. This inseparability of the opposites is a central character of the different moments of the one. Comes out in such things as the way up and the way down is the same. Well, I just said that. It leads, of course, to a certain relativism, as the statements that good and ill are one. However, in the one, all tensions are reconciled, all differences harmonized. To God, all things are fair and good and right, but men hold some things wrong and some right. Heraclitus speaks of the one as God and as wise. Quote, the wise is one only. It is unwilling and willing to be called by the name of Zeus. Unquote. God is the universal reason, logos, the universal law, immanent in all things, binding all things into a unity and determining the constant change in the universe according to universal law. Man's reason is a moment in the universal reason, for a contraction and a canalization of it. And man should therefore strive to attain to the viewpoint of reason and to live by reason, realizing the unity of all things and the reign of unalterable law, being content with the necessary process of the universe and not rebelling against it, inasmuch as it is an expression of all comprehensive, all-ordering logos or law. Reason and consciousness in man, the fiery element, are the valuable element. When the pure fire leaves the body, the water and earth which are left behind are worthless, a thought which Heraclitus expresses in the saying, quote, corpses are more fit to be cast out than dung, unquote. A man's interest, then, is to preserve his soul in a dry estate as possible. Quote, the dry is the wisest and the best, unquote. It may be pleasure to souls to become moist, but all the same, quote, it is death to soul to become water, unquote. Again, these are all quotes from Heraclitus. Souls should strive to rise above the private worlds of the sleeping to the common world of the, quote, waking, i.e., to the common world of thought and reason. This thought is, of course, the word, the logos of Heraclitus. There is, then, one immanent law and reason in the universe, of which human laws should be the embodiment of, though at best they can be but in its imperfect and relative embodiment. By stressing universal law and man's participation in reason, Heraclitus helped to pave the way for the universalist ideals of Stoicism. Right? The famous philosophy of Stoicism. This conception of universal all-ordering reason appears in the systems of the Stoics, who borrowed their cosmology from Heraclitus. But we are not entitled to suppose that Heraclitus regarded the one, fire, as a personal god, any more than Thales or Anaximenes regarded water or air as a personal god. Heraclitus was a pantheist, just as the Stoics in later times were pantheists. It is, however, true that the conception of God as the immanent ordering principle of all things, together with the moral attitude of acceptance of events as the expression of divine law, tends to produce a psychological attitude that is at variance with what would seem to be logically demanded by the theoretical identification of God with the cosmic unity. Okay, let me just check in on the chat real quick and how we're doing here. Oh, nice. Looks like everybody's doing good. Okay. Now, there's moving forward here with Heraclitus, there's only 2 more paragraphs that I really want to highlight in regards to further sort of contextualizations of his ideas. One is unity. Okay. Unity. The only unity that is worth having is a unity in difference, identity in diversity. And certainly this isn't the sort of diversity of social justice warriors, but we move on. That is to say, not of poverty, but of richness. Every material thing is a unity in diversity, consisting of molecules, atoms, electrons, etc. Of course, that's modern. That's Father Copleston here putting that in. Every little organism, also, even God himself, as we know by revelation, is unity in distinction of persons. In Christ, there is unity in diversity. Unity of person in diversity of natures. The union of the beatific vision is a union in distinction. Otherwise, it would lose its, of course, Orthodox, we don't buy into the beatific vision thing. Apart, of course, an impossibility of a simple unity and identification between God and creature. Okay. Now, just summing up then what we've read about Heraclitus so we can move on to Parmenides, we conclude then that Heraclitus of Ephesus conceived a genuine philosophical notion, even though he pursued the same way of sensual symbolism as his Ionian predecessors, and this notion of the one as essentially many can be clearly discerned beneath all the sensual symbolism. Heraclitus did not intend to rise to the conception of substantial thought, that of Aristotle, nor did he sufficiently account for the element of stability in the universe as Aristotle tried to do. But, as Hegel says, if we wish to consider the fate so just as always to persevere to posterity what is best, we must at least say what we have of Heraclitus, that it is worthy of this preservation. Okay. And so that concludes basically the first half of this video. Now we're going to be getting into Parmenides, and he's going to be a central figure for the latter half of this video, because it's his ideas that are really shaping everything. And so Parmenides is the real founder of the Eleatic school. Oh, let me get Parmenides up here. Okay. Parmenides. Now, Parmenides is the real founder of the Eleatic school, although Xenophanes is often considered to be. That I believe it's Aristotle that tells us that Xenophanes was not the founder, that it was Parmenides. But anyways, most people attribute that to Parmenides. Now, the big thing regarding Parmenides is that he's going to assert a notion of being that's going to really change the later half of pre-Socratic philosophy. And he's going to say that being is eternal, and that the process of becoming is really just an illusion, that there is no such thing as becoming. There is no such thing as change is an illusion. That's all based on sense perception. And so he's going to make sort of rational arguments for why that can't be true, and why everything that is already is, and anything that isn't going to be, because nothing that isn't can come into existence, because nothing only comes from nothing. So based on this idea, he's going to be really who everybody starts battling or dealing with or defending, depending on who they are, further in the pre-Socratic period. So he was originally a Pythagorean, and then he rejected his own philosophy, rejected his Pythagorean teachings and ideas, And again, he's considered, again, that because this idea of being is so profound, he's considered the founder of ontology, right? The philosophical school of being, of existence, ontology. So he's considered the founder of ontology, and he's also a critic of Heraclitus. Why? Because Heraclitus says everything is changing, everything is flowing. Therefore, Heraclitus is considered to be more of a proponent of becoming as opposed to the eternal being of Parmenides. And so he rejects, like I said, that as an illusion, and he's noted for really differentiating reason from the senses. He's really differentiating that in his worldview. And so let's read a little bit about Parmenides. His doctrine in brief is to the effect that being the one is, and that becoming change is illusion. It's an illusion. For if anything comes to be, then it comes either out of being or out of not being. If the former, then it already is, in which case it does not come to be. If the latter, then it is nothing, since out of nothing comes nothing. Becoming is then an illusion. Being simply is, and being is one, since plurality is also an illusion. So he's a monist, and he's adamant about this sort of ontological understanding of being. So, let's see here. Yet it is true that Parmenides rejects the Pythagorean philosophy, and indeed every philosophy that agrees with it on the point, because it admits change and movement. Now, change and movement are most certainly phenomena which appear to the senses, so that in rejecting change and movement, Parmenides is rejecting the way of sense appearance, And this is really important. It is therefore not incorrect to say that Parmenides introduced the most important distinction between reason and senses, truth and appearance. It is true, of course, that even Thales recognized this distinction to a certain extent, for his supposed truth that all is water is scarcely perceptible immediately to the senses. It needs reason, right? So even Thales saying that everything is water, well, you don't actually just see that. So that's where the beginning of the sort of rational arguments that go beyond sense perception, we can see that in Thales, but Parmenides is really hitting that home. The central truth of Heraclitus is, again, a truth of reason and far exceeds the common opinion of men, who trust in everything to sense appearance. It is also true that Heraclitus even makes this distinction partly explicit, for does he not distinguish between mere common sense and his logos? Yet it is Parmenides who first lays great and explicit stress on the distinction, and it is easy enough to understand why he does so when we consider the conclusions to which he came. In the Platonic philosophy, the distinction became of cardinal importance, as indeed it must be in all forms of idealism. Yet, though Parmenides enunciates a distinction which was to become a fundamental tenet of idealism, the temptation to speak of him as though he were himself an idealist is to be rejected. Parmenides eyes the one in sensual and material, and to turn him into an objective idealist of the 19th century type is to be guilty of an anachronism. It does not follow from the negation of change that one is idea. And so this is really important, and Copleston actually kind of goes to town on a few prominent scholars that actually I'm not too familiar with, but they try to relate Parmenides to the idealist school, German idealism. So somebody like Hegel. And Parmenides, though he believes in the absolute one, though he believes in a separation between reason and the senses, his being is still material. It's not idealistic, and it's not an incorporeal. It's corporeal. He believes that matter, he believes the universe is eternal. And so if Parmenides had represented the one as self-subsistent thought, Plato and Aristotle would hardly have failed to record the fact, and Socrates would not have found the first sober philosopher in Anaxagoras with his concept of mind or nous. The truth really seems to be that Though Parmenides does assert the distinction between reason and sense, he asserts it not to establish an idealist system, but to establish a system of monistic materialism, in which change and movement are dismissed as illusory. Only reason can apprehend reality, but the reality which reason apprehends is material. This is not idealism, but materialism. His first great assertion is that it, i.e. reality, being, of whatever nature it may be, exists, and cannot be. And cannot not be. It is, and it is impossible for it to not be. Being can be spoken of, and it can be the object of my thought. But that which I can think about and speak of can be, quote, for it is the same thing as that can be thought and that can be, unquote. But if it can be, then it is. Why? Because if it could be and yet were not, then it would be nothing. Now nothing cannot be the object of speech or thought. For to speak about nothing is to not speak, and to think about nothing is at the same time to not think at all. Besides, if it merely could be, then paradoxically, it could never come to be, for it would have come out of nothing, and out of nothing comes nothing, not something. Being then, reality, it was first not possible, i.e. nothing then existent. It was always existent. More accurately, it is and always will be. Being, therefore, it arises neither out of being nor out of non-being. It never came into being, but simply is. And as this must apply to all being, nothing ever becomes. For if anything ever becomes, however trifling, the same difficulty always recurs. Does it come out of being or out of not being? And so skipping forward, that Parmenides regarded being as material seems to be clearly indicated by his assertion that being, the one, is finite. Now this is very interesting. It is finite. Infinite for him must have meant indeterminate and indefinite, and being, as the real, cannot be indefinite or indeterminate, cannot change, cannot be conceived as expanding into empty space. It must be definite, determinate, complete. It would seem then that Burnet, this is a other scholar who's written on the history of philosophy, is right when he aptly says Parmenides is not, as some have said, the father of idealism. On the contrary, all materialism depends on his view of reality. Professor Stacey has to admit that Parmenides, Melusus, and the Eleatics generally did regard being as, in some sense, material. But he still tries to make out that Parmenides was an idealist in that he held the cardinal thesis of idealism, that the absolute reality of which the world is a manifestation consists in thought and concepts. It is perfectly true that being of Parmenides can be grasped only by thought, but so can reality of Thales and Anaximenes be grasped only by thought and concepts. But to equate being grasped in thought with being thought is surely a confusion. On the one hand, Parmenides asserted the unchangeability of being, and insofar he is conceived of being as material, he asserted the indestructibility of matter. Empedocles and Democritus adopted this position and used it in their atomistic doctrine. But while Parmenides felt himself compelled to dismiss change and becoming as an illusion, thus adopting the very opposite position of that of Heraclitus, Democritus could not reject what appears to be an inescapable fact of experience, which needs more explanation than a curt dismissal. Democritus, therefore, while adopting Parmenides' thesis that being can neither arise nor pass away, the indestructibility of matter, interpreted change as due to the aggregation and separation of indestructible particles of matter. He was an atomist. That's an atomic theory. On the other hand, it is an historical fact that Plato seized on the thesis of Parmenides concerning the unchangeability of being and identified the abiding being with a subsequent and objective idea. To that extent, therefore, Parmenides may be called the father of idealism, in that the first great idealist adopted a cardinal tenet
of Parmenides and interpret it from an idealistic standpoint. Moreover, Plato made great use of Parmenides' distinction between the world and reason and the world of sense or appearance. But if in that historical sense Parmenides may rightly be described as the father of idealism, through his undoubted influence on Plato, it must be understood at the same time that Parmenides himself taught a materialistic doctrine, and that materialists like Democritus were his legitimate children. Heraclitus, in his theory of Pante Re, all flows, right? Everything's changing, therefore an emphasis on becoming as opposed to being, laid stress on total exclusion of being, saying that there is becoming, but nothing which becomes. He affirmed the existence of the one, fire, but held that change, or logos, becoming, tension, are essential to the being, even to the exclusion of becoming, or to the existence of the one. Parmenides, on the other hand, asserted being, even to the exclusion of becoming, affirming that change and movement are illusory. Plato attempted a synthesis of the two, a combination of which is true in each. He adopts Parmenides' distinction between thought and sense, and declares that sense objects, the objects of sense perception, are not the objects of true knowledge, for they do not possess the necessary stability, being subject to the Heraclitean flux. The objects of true knowledge are stable and eternal, like the being of Parmenides, but they are not material, like the being of Parmenides. They are, on the contrary, ideal, subsistent, in immaterial forms, hierarchically arranged and culminating in the form of the good. The synthesis may be said to have been worked out further by Aristotle. Being, in the sense of ultimate and immaterial reality, God is changeless, subsistent, thought. As to material being, Aristotle agrees with Heraclitus that it is subject to change and rejects the position of Parmenides, but Aristotle accounts better than Heraclitus did for the relative stability in things by making Plato's forms or ideas concrete formal principles and objects in this world. And so, with that mouthful, we now kind of conclude Parmenides and our understanding of the Pre-Socratics, and we actually move to Zeno, who's a very interesting character and who's going to be a student of Parmenides. And so I'm sure you guys have heard of Zeno's paradoxes, and it's these paradoxes that he uses to refute the Pythagorean school. So Zeno is a defender of his teacher Parmenides, and he creates all these really interesting paradoxes. Here, let me pull some of them up so we can talk about them. So the first one I want to talk about is the dichotomy paradox. So again, I'm sure you guys have heard of Zeno. You've heard of Zeno's paradoxes. Like I said, he's a disciple of Parmenides. He's creating these paradoxes to attack the worldview of the Pythagoreans and their school. He has ingenious arguments and riddles. And he also accepts, because of his teacher, the eternality of being, and that nothing actually becomes. There is no becoming. And he rejects the idea of real movement. And he does this through his paradoxes. And that's what I want to highlight first, is the dichotomy paradox. And so the dichotomy paradox basically says that, take yourself for an example. Say you are at point A and you want to get to point B. Well, halfway between point A and point B is the halfway mark. And to get to point B, you have to get to that halfway mark. But once you get to that halfway mark, there's another halfway mark between you and point B. And then, therefore, to get to point B, you're going to have to get to that halfway mark. And then once you get to that quarter mark, there's going to be another mark. And the idea is this infinite regress of having, of the, how would you explain it? That as you got the infinite regression of like taking half of something, you can do that supposedly for, infinity. And so he's taking this idea and basically saying that movement isn't real, because you're never actually going to get to point B, because what you can do is only get to half. And so this idea, this dichotomy paradox, is also highlighted in a famous paradox called Achilles and the Tortoise. So So Achilles, the famous, athlete of Greek mythology, he is racing a tortoise. And so imagine the tortoise is, let's say, 100 meters in front of Achilles. And they say, go. Now, Achilles is going to take him a certain amount of time to get to where the tortoise started. And the tortoise, maybe within the time period it took Achilles to get from 0 to 100 meters, it took the tortoise that time to get to 2 meters. But when Achilles is at 100 meters and the tortoise is 2 meters away from him, he can only half the distance. And therefore, the tortoise, he can never actually pass the tortoise. This is one of his paradoxes. And so, again, I'll read a little bit about it. So in the paradox of Achilles and the tortoise, Achilles is in a foot race with the tortoise. Achilles allows the tortoise a head start. I've already said that. It will then take Achilles some further time to run the distance, by which time the tortoise has already advanced further, and then more time still to reach the third point where the tortoise moves ahead. So first point, he reaches the 100-meter mark. Tortoise is at point B. It's going to take him a certain period of time to get to that point. By that time, the tortoise is already going to have moved as well. And so thus, whenever Achilles arrives somewhere the tortoise has been, he still has some distance to go before he can ever reach the tortoise. As Aristotle noted, this argument is similar to the dichotomy paradox, which I just highlighted, the sort of halving of distances. It lacks, however, an apparent conclusion of motionlessness. So that would be obviously the critique to that. But there's also what's called the arrow paradox. I don't know if you guys have heard of that one. Again, this is from Zeno, and it basically goes that in the arrow paradox, Zeno states that for motion to occur, an object must change the position which it occupies. He gives an example of an arrow in flight. He states that in any one durationless instant of time, the arrow is neither moving to where it is, nor to where it is not. It cannot move to where it is not, because no time elapses for it to move there. It cannot move to where it is, because it is already there. In other words, at every instant of time, there is no motion occurring. If everything is motionless at every instant, and time is entirely composed of instances, then motion is impossible. So that is the kind of those are just a few of his paradoxes. Now he has tons of paradoxes, but that stuff's pretty interesting because he's clearly, well, as we'll discuss, he's really putting all the Pythagoreans on their heels because he is making rational arguments that aren't based in sense perception, right? So to say, well, Achilles can never pass the tortoise, that's ridiculous. If he just keeps running, eventually he's going to pass. I've watched a foot race. I know how that happens. But he makes these logical arguments, these sort of rational paradoxes that leave people a little perplexed. And so he's extremely, extremely clever. Zeno, an extremely clever guy. So let's read a little bit about Zeno from Father Copleston. Zeno, a firm adherent of the theory of Parmenides, endeavors to prove it, or at least to demonstrate that it is by no means ridiculous, by the expedient of showing that the pluralism of the Pythagoreans is involved in insoluble difficulties, and that change and motion are impossible even on their pluralistic hypotheses. And so he's trying to show that the Pythagorean worldview is inconsistent even on its own bases, its own suppositions, presuppositions. The arguments of Zeno, then, even on their pluralistic hypothesis, the arguments of Zeno, then, are meant to refute the Pythagorean opponents of Parmenides by a series of clever reductions ad absurdum. Plato makes this quite clear in Parmenides when he indicates the purpose of Zeno's book. Quote, the truth is that these writings are meant to be some protection to the arguments of Parmenides against those who attack him and show the many ridiculous and contradictory results which they suppose to follow from the affirmation of the one. My writing is an answer to the partisans of many of it and returns their attacks with interest, with a view to showing that the hypothesis of the many, if examined sufficiently in detail, leads to even more ridiculous results than the hypothesis of the one, unquote. And so we see that Plato has a little bit of sympathies then with Parmenides and Zeno's project here. So in a section titled Proofs Against Pythagorean Pluralism, this is what we read. Let us suppose with the Pythagoreans that reality is made up of units. These units are either with magnitude or without magnitude. If the former, then a line, for example, as made up of units possessed of magnitude, will be infinitely divisible, since however far you divide, the units will still have magnitude and so be divisible. The Pythagoreans are thus faced with this dilemma. Either everything in the universe is infinitely great, or everything in the universe is infinitely small. The conclusion which Zeno wishes us to draw from this argument is, of course, that the suppositions from which the dilemma flows is an absurd supposition, namely that the universe and everything in it are composed of units. If the Pythagoreans think that the hypothesis of the one is absurd and leads to ridiculous conclusions, it has now been shown that the contrary hypothesis, that the many, is productive of equally ridiculous conclusions. And so we can see here, again, the one and the many. We see a fight between Parmenides and Zeno and the one versus the many of the Pythagoreans. Now, this is another section within the refutations against Pythagorean pluralism by Zeno here. If there is a many, then we ought to be able to say how many there are. At least we should be numerable. If they are not numerable, how can they exist? On the other hand, they cannot possibly be numerable, but must be infinite. Why? Because between any two assigned units, there will always be other units, just as a line is infinitely divisible, right? That sort of dichotomy paradox is highlighting this idea by Zeno. But it is absurd to say that many are finite in number and infinite in number at the same time. And this is what the Pythagoreans were doing. So moving to another point of tension between Zeno and the Pythagoreans, arguments against the Pythagorean doctrine of space. And so it reads, Parmenides denied the existence of the void or empty space, and Zeno tries to support this denial by reducing the opposite view to absurdity. Suppose for a moment that there is a space in which things are. If it is nothing, then things cannot be in it. If, however, it is something, it will itself be in space, and that space will itself be in space, and so on indefinitely. But this is an absurdity. Things, therefore, are not in space or in an empty void, and Parmenides was quite right to deny the existence of a void. So, pretty interesting stuff there. Here we're going to get into a section against motion. So now we're going to be arguments concerning motion. The most celebrated arguments of Zeno are those concerning motion. It should be remembered that what Zeno is attempting to show us is this, that motion, which Parmenides denied, is equally impossible on the pluralistic theory of the Pythagoreans. Let us suppose that you want to cross a stadium or race course. In order to do so, you would have to traverse an infinite number of points on the Pythagorean hypothesis, that is to say. Moreover, you would have to travel the distance in finite time if you wanted to get to the other side at all. But how can you traverse an infinite number of points and so an infinite distance in a finite time? We must conclude that you cannot cross the stadium. Indeed, we must conclude that no object can traverse any distance whatsoever, for the same difficulty always recurs, and that all motion is consequently impossible. So, obviously not maybe what we would think from our sense perception, of course. So, then he gives a rundown of the Achilles and the tortoise paradox, which I've already basically highlighted. And then one of Pythagorean. Yep. Okay, so we've already addressed those paradoxes. Now we'll move on to something else. Again, regarding Zeno here. How are we to interpret these arguments of Zeno? It is important not to let oneself think, quote, these are mere sophistries on the part of Zeno. They are ingenious tricks, but they err by supposing that a line is composed of points in time of discrete moments, unquote. It may be that the solution to the riddles is to be found in showing that the line and time are continuous and not discrete. But then Zeno was not concerned to hold that they are discrete. On the contrary, he is concerned to show the absurd consequences which flow from presupposing that they are discrete. Zeno, as a disciple of Parmenides, believed that motion is an illusion and is impossible. But in the foregoing arguments, his aim is to prove that even on the pluralistic hypothesis, motion is equally impossible, and that the assumption of its possibility leads to contradictory and absurd conclusions. Zeno's position was as follows, quote, the real is a plenum, a complete continuum, and motion is impossible. Our adversaries assert motion and try to explain it by an appeal to a pluralistic hypothesis. I propose to show that this hypothesis does nothing to explain motion, but only lands one in absurdities, unquote. Zeno thus reduced the hypotheses of his adversities to absurdity, and the real result of this dialectic was not so much to establish Parmenidean monism, which is exposed to insuperable objections, as to show the necessity of admitting the concept of continuous quantity. And now we're going to talk a little bit about the Eleatics. The Eleatics then deny the reality of multiplicity of motion. There is one principle, being, which is conceived of as a material and motionless. They do not deny, of course, that we sense motion, that we sense motion and multiplicity, but they declare that what we sense is an illusion. It is mere appearance. True being is to be found not by sense, but by thought, and thought shows that there can be no plurality, no movement, no change. The Eleatics thus attempt, as the earlier Greek philosophers attempted before them, to discover the one principle of the world, the one in the many, right? The world, however, as it presents itself to us, is clearly a pluralistic world. The question is, therefore, to do justice to both elements through the doctrine of unity in diversity, identity in difference, i.e. the logos. The Pythagoreans asserted plurality to the practical exclusion of the one. There are many ones. The Eleatics asserted the one to the exclusion of the many, but if you cling to the plurality which is suggested by sense experience, then you must also admit change. And if you admit change of the one thing into another, you cannot avoid the recurring problem as to the character of the common element in the things which change. Okay, and that's really the last thing. There's some other stuff, but that was the last thing I really wanted to highlight about Zeno. So now, moving right along, looks like we're about to approach 2 hours. How we doing, everybody? Uh-oh. Looks like my computer's frozen. You gotta be kidding me. Oh, there it goes. Whew. Thought I lost my computer there for a second. Okay, let's change. We're done with Zeno. We're now going to get Empedocles. Empedocles. Okay. Empedocles. All right, moving right along here, guys. So now I want to talk about Empedocles. Existed from 494 to 443. He was actually, there's legends of him being a magician, sort of wonder worker. And the reason being is, well, he contributed quite a bit to medicine. So he was interested in healing and things like that. He had a cosmogonic theory of the 4 elements. So this is where we get the whole idea of the 4 elements. Earth, water, air, fire. Earth, water, air, fire. We've already highlighted the Urstoff of the Ionian School of Heraclitus, trying to identify the principal element of the world being one of these 4 elements. Now, curious if you guys know what elements are in the Chinese 5 elemental system that are not in the Greek or the Western 4 element system. I was curious if anybody knew that off the top of their head. So he discussed cosmic forces. This is one of the other unique things about Empedocles, is that he offers an account of movement, of why things move and separate, coagulate. Right, I mean, that's a bit of an alchemical term, but congeal, form, make formations. He said it was due to love and strife, love and hate, and that love and hate actually ruled the universe, ruled creation, if you will. And he was also a promoter of the Pythagorean transmigration of souls. So Empedocles stands kind of in between both worlds. I'm being both a proponent of sort of eternal being and the Pythagorean transmigration of souls. And so with his idea of these elements, we can see where the Atomist school, the atomic theory, the idea that everything is reduced to atoms, where they're going to get some of their ideas from is going to be Empedocles. And so first thing that I want to say about Empedocles is Empedocles does not so much produce a new philosophy as an endeavor to weld together and reconcile the thought of his predecessors. Parmenides had held that being is, and that being is material. Empedocles not only adopted this position, but also the fundamental thought of Parmenides, that being cannot arise or pass away, for being cannot arise from not being, nor can being pass into not being. Matter then is without beginning, without end, and is indestructible. So far, then, Empedocles agrees with Parmenides, but on the other hand, again, he takes a Pythagorean. We know Parmenides and the Pythagoreans were at odds with each other, and he takes a Pythagorean understanding of the transmigration of souls, but a Parmenidean understanding of being, of ontology. But on the other hand, change is a fact which cannot be denied, and the dismissal of change as illusory could not long be maintained. It remained then to find a way of reconciling the fact of the existence of change and motion with the principle of Parmenides, that being, which, be it remembered, is material according to Parmenides, neither comes into being nor passes away. That creation, materiality, is eternal. Now, though Thales had believed all things to be ultimately water and Anaximenes air, they believed that one kind of matter can become another kind of matter, at least in the sense that, example given, water becomes earth and air becomes fire. Empedocles, however, interpreting Parmenides' principle of the unchangeability of being in his own way, held that one kind of matter cannot become another kind of matter, but that there are fundamental and eternal kinds of matter or elements: earth, fire, air, and water. The familiar classification of the 4 elements was therefore invented by Empedocles, though he speaks of them not as elements but as, quote, the roots of all. Earth cannot become water, nor water earth. The 4 kinds of matter are unchangeable and ultimate particles, which from the concrete objects of the world by their mingling. So objects come into being through the mingling of the elements. They cease to be through the separation of the elements, but the elements themselves neither come into being nor pass away, but remain ever unchanged. Empedocles therefore saw the only possible way for reconciling the materialistic position of Parmenides with the evident fact of change, the way of postulating a multiplicity of ultimate material particles, and may thus be called a mediator between the system of Parmenides and the evidence of the senses. Now, the Ionian philosophers, who we began this video with, had failed to explain the process of nature. If everything is composed of air, as Anaximenes thought, how do the objects of our experience come into being? What force is responsible for the cyclical process of nature? Anaximenes assumed that air transforms itself into other kinds of matter through its own inherent power, but Empedocles saw that it is necessary to postulate active forces. So there has to be active forces that is responsible for the movement and change of reality. What are those active forces? These forces he found in love and hate, and harmony and discord. In spite of their names, however, the forces are conceived by Empedocles as physical and material forces. Love, or attraction, bringing the particles of the four elements together and building up. Hate, or strife, separating the particles and causing the cessation of objects themselves. According to Empedocles, the world process is circular in the sense that there is a periodic world cycles. And so we see a cyclical understanding of the world. In this primary stage, and so his cyclical understanding of the world is really going to be that the world begins with love and then enters hate and strife, and then the world begins to break up. These elements begin to break up. Eventually they become all broken up, and then love re-enters and things start to congeal again, and we get forms. And so he claims that the world in which the time in that cycle which we're existing is right in the middle. It's right in the middle between love and hate. In this primary stage, the process of love is the governing principle, and the whole is called a blessed God. Hate, however, is round about the sphere, and when hate penetrates within the sphere, the process of separation, the disuniting of the particles, is begun. The doctrine of transmigration of souls is taught by Empedocles. In the book of the Purifications, he even declares, quote, "For I have already been in the past a boy and a girl, a shrub and a bird, and a fish which lives in the sea," unquote. It can scarcely be said, however, that this doctrine fits in well with the cosmological system of Empedocles, since if all things are composed of material particles, which separate at death, and if, quote, "the blood round the heart is the thought of men," unquote, there is little room left for immortality. But Empedocles may not have realized this discrepancy between his philosophical and religious theories. Aristotle remarks that Empedocles made no distinction between thought and perception. His actual theory of vision is, given by Theophrastus, a theory used by Plato in the Timaeus. In sense perception, there is a meeting between an element in us and a similar element outside us. All things are constantly giving off effluences, and when the pores of the sense organs are the right size, then these effluences enter in and perception takes place. In conclusion, then, for Empedocles, we may remind ourselves that Empedocles tried to reconcile the theses of Parmenides that being can neither come to be nor pass away with the evident fact of change by postulating ultimate particles of the four elements, and mingling of which forms the concrete objects of this world, and the separation of which constitutes the passing away of such objects. He failed, however, to explain how the material cyclical process of nature takes place, but had recourse to mythological forces, love and hate. It was left to Anaxagoras to introduce the concept of mind as the original cause of the world process. And that's who we get to now, Anaxagoras, who introduces nous. And so let's get Empedocles out of here, and we're bringing in Anaxagoras. Okay. All right. Now, Anaxagoras, why is he important? Well, he was Persian, first of all, so he wasn't even a Greek, although he contributed greatly to Greek philosophy. There's actually theories about how he got to Athens. He may have actually came with the Persian army, which I found that pretty interesting. And then, like I said, he introduced the concept of nous, and this is a big deal because he's now introducing the idea of mind and the mind's relationship to the world. Now, this nous is not like what will be developed in later Greek philosophy, and it's certainly not the nous of Orthodox Christianity. And in fact, at the end of this section, I have a point where Socrates is actually greatly disappointed with Anaxagoras. So, first thing that I wanted to read then is Anaxagoras, like Empedocles, accepted the theory of Parmenides that being neither comes into being nor passes away, but is unchangeable. The Hellenes the Hellenes, do not understand rightly coming into being and passing away, for nothing comes into being or passes away, but there is a mingling and a separation of things which are, unquote, Anaxagoras. Both thinkers, then, are in agreement as to the indestructibility of matter, and both reconcile this theory with the evident fact of change by positing indestructible material particles, the mingling of which forms objects, the separation of which explains the passing away of objects. But Anaxagoras will not agree with Empedocles that the ultimate units are particles, corresponding to the four elements, earth, air, fire, and water. He teaches that everything which has parts qualitatively the same as the whole is ultimate and undivided. Thus, it is related by Aristotle that Anaxagoras did not hold Empedocles' elements, earth, air, fire, and water, to be really ultimate. On the contrary, they are mixtures composed of many qualitatively different particles. In the beginning, particles, there is no indivisible particle, according to Anaxagoras, of all kinds were mingled together. Quote, all things were together, infinite, both in number and in smallness, for the small too was infinite. And when all things were together, none of them could be distinguished from their smallness, unquote. Quote, all things are in the whole, unquote. The objects of experience arise when ultimate particles have been so brought together that in the resulting object, particles of a certain kind predominate. And so, talking about grass then, grass therefore consists predominantly of grass, but it also contains other kinds of particles. For, quote, in everything there is a portion of everything, unquote. And, quote, the things that are in one world are not divided nor cut off from the other world with a hatchet, neither the warm from the cold nor the cold from the warm, unquote. In this way, Anaxagoras sought to maintain the Parmenidean doctrine concerning being, while at the same time adopting a realist attitude towards change, not dismissing it as an illusion of the senses, but accepting it as a fact, and then trying to reconcile it with the Eleatic theory of being. Later on, Aristotle would attempt to solve the difficulties raised by the doctrine of Parmenides in regard to change by means of distinction between potency and act. And that's a whole nother video, Aristotle on potency and act. So far, Anaxagoras' philosophy is a variant of Empedocles' interpretation and adaptation of Parmenides and offers no particularly valuable features. But when we come to the question of the power or force that is responsible for forming of things at the first mass, we arrive at the peculiar contribution of Anaxagoras to philosophy. Empedocles had attributed motion to the universe, to the two physical forces of love and strife, but Anaxagoras introduces instead the principle of nous, or mind. With Anaxagoras, a light, if still a weak one, begins to dawn because the understanding is now recognized as the principle. Nous, says Anaxagoras, has power over all things that have life, both greater and smaller. And nous had power over the whole revolution, so that it began to revolve at the start. And nous set in order all things that were to be, and all things that were and are now and that will be. And this revolution in which we revolve the stars and the sun and the moon and the air and the ether, which are separated off. And the revolution itself caused the separating off, and this dense is separated off from the rare, the warm from the cold, the bright from the dark, and the dry from the moist. And there are many portions in many things, but no thing is altogether separated off from anything except nous. All nous is alike, both the greater and the smaller, but nothing else is like anything else. But each single thing is, and most manifestly, those things which there are most in it. Nous, quote, is infinite and self-ruled, and is mixed with nothing, but is alone, itself by itself, unquote. How then did Anaxagoras conceive of nous? He calls it, quote, the finest of all things and the purest, and it has all knowledge about everything and the greatest power, unquote. He also speaks of nous being, quote, there were, everything else is, in the surrounding mass, unquote. That's a Bit of a strange quote. The philosopher thus speaks of nous or mind in material terms as being, quote, the thinnest of all things, unquote, and as occupying space. On the strength of this, Burnet, another philosopher who wrote a history of philosophy, declares that Anaxagoras never rose above the conception of a corporeal principle. He made nous purer than other material things, but never reached the idea of an immaterial or incorporeal thing. If we speak of mind as clear or as someone's mind as being greater than that of another, we are not on that account to be called materialist. That Anaxagoras conceived of nous as occupying space is not sufficient proof that he would have declared nous to be corporeal had he ever conceived of the notion of a sharp distinction between mind and matter. The non-spatiality of the mind is a later conception. Probably the most satisfactory interpretation is that Anaxagoras, in his concept of the spiritual, did not succeed in grasping clearly the radical difference between the spiritual and the corporeal, but that is not the same as saying that he was a dogmatic materialist. On the contrary, he first introduces a spiritual and an intellectual principle, though he fails to understand fully the essential difference between that principle and the matter which it forms or sets in motion. Nous is present in all living things, men, animals, plants, and is the same in all. Differences between these objects are due then not to essential differences between their souls, but to differences between their bodies, which facilitate or handicap the fuller working of nous. Nous is not to be thought of as creating matter. Matter is eternal, and the function of nous seems to be set in the rotary movement or vortex going in part of the mixed mass, the action of the vortex itself as it spreads, accounting for the subsequent motion. Thus Aristotle, who says in the Metaphysics that Anaxagoras stood out like a sober man from the random talkers that had preceded him, also says that Anaxagoras uses mind as a deus ex machina to account for the formation of the world, and whenever he is at a loss to explain why anything necessarily is, he drags it in. But in the case, he makes anything rather than mind the cause, unquote. We can easily understand then the disappointment of Socrates, who, thinking he had come upon an entirely new approach when he discovered Anaxagoras, found, quote, my extravagant expectations were all dashed to the ground when I went on and found that the man made no use of mind at all. He ascribed no causal power whatever to it in the ordering of things, but to airs, to ethers, to waters, and a host of other strange things, unquote. So I thought that was hilarious that Socrates had that to say about Anaxagoras, but we see that he developed the idea, or at least introduced the concept of nous, which we find very important. So I think that was certainly worth learning about there. And lastly, we are going to get into the Atomist school, because clearly this school probably affects us the most in the present day. Is the Atomist school. Let's all right. Bam. Now let's reduce this thing, get it smaller. Okay, Leucippus and the Atomist school. Come on, Leucippus. Make you bigger, bud. There we go. Okay. Now, finally, rounding about our discussion on pre-Socratic philosophy, we end with the Atomist. The Atomist, who, of course, we live in an atomic world. The scientific materialist worldview is certainly built upon this sort of, or at least developed from what we'll see here with the Atomist school. And so with the Atomists, we see, well, it's founded by Leucippus here. And that is, we know that from Aristotle and Theophrastus. He was a disciple of Zeno. So Leucippus was a student of Zeno. Zeno paradox is the guy that had all these crazy ideas that was proving that motion doesn't exist. And he continues on with the Parmenidean project, what is called the Ionaian School, the Eleatic School there. He believed that matter is eternal. He believed that being is eternal. And so the atomists were continuing on in the Parmenidean worldview, which to a degree is basically like the scientific worldview. And he also, interestingly, builds upon Pythagoras. So here, let's get into the Atomist school in Leucippus. In treating of the Atomist philosophy, therefore, we cannot pretend to distinguish between what is due to Leucippus and what is due to Democritus. So Democritus being the other famous Atomist, since Democritus is of considerably later date and cannot with historical accuracy be classed among the Pre-Socratics. We will leave to a later chapter his doctrine of sense perception, by which he attempted to answer Pythagoras and his theory of human conduct. The Atomist philosophy is really the logical development of the philosophy of Empedocles. He was the one that, developed the four elements. Okay. The latter had tried to reconcile the Parmenidean principle of the denial and passage of being into not being and vice versa with the evident fact of change by postulating four elements which mix together in various proportions from the objects of our experience. He did not, however, really work out his doctrine of particles, nor did he carry out a quantitative explanation or qualitative differences to its logical conclusion. The philosophy of Empedocles formed a transitional stage to the explanation of a qualitative differences by a mechanical juxtaposition of material particles in various patterns. Moreover, Empedocles forces love and strife, or love and hate, were metaphorical powers which would have to be eliminated in a thoroughgoing mechanical philosophy. The final step to complete mechanism was attempted by the Atomists. According to Leucippus and Democritus, there are an infinite number of indivisible units, which are called atoms. These are imperceptible, since they are too small to be perceived by the senses. The atoms differ in size and shape, but have no quality save that of solidity and impenetrability. Infinite in number, they move in the void. Parmenides had denied the reality of space. The Pythagoreans had admitted a void to keep their units apart, but they identified it with an atmospheric air, which Empedocles showed to be corporeal. Leucippus, however, affirmed at the same time the non-reality of space in its existence, meaning by non-reality, non-corporeity. This position is expressed by saying that what is not is just as much as real as what is. Space then, or the void, is not corporeal, but is as real as body. The later Epicureans, who's most famous for the sort of the Atomist school of thought, but he's much later, held that the atoms all move downwards in the void through the force of weight, probably influenced by Aristotle's idea of absolute weight and lightness. Jumping forward. However, in whatever way the atoms originally moved in the void, at the same point of time, collisions between atoms occurred. Those of irregular shape becoming entangled with one another and forming groups of atoms. In this way, the vortex is set up and a world is in process of formation. Whereas Anaxagoras thought that the larger bodies would be driven furthest from the center, Leucippus said the opposite, believing wrongly that in the eddy of wind or water, the larger bodies tended towards the center. It is at once noticeable that neither Empedocles' forces of love and hate, nor the nous of Anaxagoras appears in the Atomist philosophy. Leucippus evidently did not consider any moving force to be a necessary hypothesis. In the beginning existed atoms in the void, and that was all. From the beginning arose the world of our experience, and no external power or moving force is assumed as a necessary cause for the primal motion. Apparently, the early cosmologists did not think of motion as requiring any explanation, and in the Atomist philosophy, the eternal movement of the atomist is regarded as self-sufficient. To us, indeed, it may well seem strange to deny chance and yet to posit an eternal unexplained motion. Aristotle blames the atomists for not explaining the source of motion and the kind of motion, but we ought not to conclude that Leucippus meant to ascribe the motion of the atoms to chance. To him, the eternal motion and continuation of motion required no explanation. In our opinion, the mind boggles at such a theory and cannot rest content with Leucippus's ultimate, but it is an interesting historical fact that he himself was content with this ultimate and sought no first unmoved mover. It is to be noted that the atoms of Leucippus and Democritus are the Pythagorean monads endowed with the properties of Parmenidean being. We see blending there, right, of two very different schools. For each is as the Parmenidean one, and inasmuch as the elements arise from the various arrangements and positions of the atoms, they may be likened to the Pythagorean numbers. If the latter are to be regarded as patterns or figurative numbers, this can be the only sense to be attached to Aristotle's dictum that Leucippus and Democritus virtually make all things number too and produce them from numbers. The attempt to give a complete explanation of the world in terms of mechanical materialism has, as we all know, reappeared in a much more thorough form in the modern era under the influence of physical science, but the brilliant hypothesis of Leucippus and Democritus was by no means the last word in Greek philosophy. Subsequent Greek philosophers were to see that the richness of the world cannot in all its spheres be reduced to the mechanical interplay of atoms. And so that ends our great movement through pre-Socratic philosophy. We began with the Ionian School, with Thales, with Anaximander, with Anaximenes, then we moved to the Pythagorean School with Pythagoras and their emphasis on numbers and music and measurement. Then we went to Heraclitus and his attempt to unify or answer the one and the many with his concept of logos as fire. And so he contributed with the same project as the Ionians, the Urstroph, the principal element of the world. Heraclitus says, well, it's fire. The Ionians, yet Thales say it was water, yet Anaximenes say it was air. But Heraclitus really contributes the logos. He contributes this idea of something that it unifies opposites, and therefore opposites aren't entirely in opposition to each other. And then we have Parmenides, who actually critiques Heraclitus, because what also did Heraclitus say that was so important? Well, he said Pante Rei, all flows. You can't step into the same river twice, right? The water's always moving. Well, that emphasizes the idea of becoming, where Parmenides rejected the idea of becoming, rejected the idea of movement itself, rejected the idea of space, and instead believed in the eternal being. It is, right? It is. Being is eternal and never changes. Now, what appears to be changed, that's all an illusion, according to Parmenides. And so Zeno, his student, then defends Parmenides, his teacher, by these incredible paradoxes, these very clever and ingenious riddles, to try to show that the Pythagorean worldview is, if they're going to reject the one being of Parmenides, well, the Pythagorean worldview is way more unstable and contradictory than anything that they were offering. And that was what Zeno was trying to do, was rebut a lot of the Pythagorean critics to his teacher Parmenides. And then, of course, we have Empedocles, who also contributed the Parmenidean understanding of being. What do I mean by that? That being is eternal. And Empedocles, though, had a different idea of the four elements. So Empedocles offers the concept of the four elements, and the four elements therefore being these kind of primordial. It's not just one of them, it's all four of them that are primordial, that are the principal building blocks of reality. And though they are also eternal. And so what did he push? Well, a new force. There's forces behind this eternal movement of being, and that's love and hate. And so Empedocles couched his whole worldview in this idea of a dynamic between love and hate that is bringing these elements, these four elements together to congeal, to construct, to form things in the world. And then hate is coming in and separating them. And so the reduction of form is due to hate. That was Empedocles. And then we got Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras was the Persian. Anaxagoras had the idea of nous. And so Anaxagoras basically continued the Parmenidean understanding of being. But what was really important for Anaxagoras is that he contributed, it was basically, he was in line basically with Empedocles, but where did he change with Empedocles? Anaxagoras said, no, it's not love and hate, it's the mind. It's the nous. It's the mind that is the force behind the construction and the deconstruction or the separating of elements in the world. And so once we got there, then we got Leucippus in the Atomist school, and Democritus, though we didn't address Democritus because he's technically later in history, but we discussed how Anaxagoras had the nous, Leucippus in the Atomist school picked up the idea of particles, this idea of elements that was being developed by Empedocles, and was really a bridge between Parmenidean being, so being is eternal, and then understandings of Pythagoreanism. So and that's where the Atomist school is really this sort of blending with the basic concept of Parmenides with some of the main ideas of the Pythagorean school, and then we get the Atomist school. And that basically sums up pre-Socratic philosophy. And so we see the questions of the one and the many and the positing of various Urstoffs. We see the questioning of the eternality of being, which most of them agreed in. And we're going to see that the same with Aristotle and Plato, who also agree that being is eternal. And we see the differentiation of reason and sense. This is a big one that's developed in the pre-Socratic period, is the differentiation between sense perception and reason itself. And this whole thing, though, what is the biggest commonality between all this is that pre-Socratic philosophy was focused on the exterior world, the outer world, and not so much the self. So we heard very, very little. Of course, we heard a lot about the soul in regard to the Pythagorean school, but that was really about it. Everything else was about the external world. And so much of pre-Socratic philosophy is about the world and not about the self. Man is not the main principle of observation or philosophical inquiry. It is the external world. And so with that basically concludes my video. If you guys have any questions, feel free to super chat or say something in the comment section. Just curious if you guys had any questions. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you guys have not liked this video, please like it. That helps in the old YouTube rankings, as you know. So please like the video if you haven't done that yet. And I'll just wait here for a few seconds to let me know if you guys have any questions. I have a few minutes. I could answer some stuff. I have a handful of different topics that I'm really going to be getting into here in the future. I'm going to get into some more mystical, some more magical, some more esotericism stuff. I don't think that is covered a whole lot from a Christian perspective. And so that's one of the areas that I want to get into a little bit more. But anyways, it looks like you guys are good to go. And so let's get out of here. Thank you guys. I appreciate all the love and support. Please like, share, and subscribe. Very, very thankful and love all you guys for all the love and support. I really, really do appreciate it. But again, please like, share, and subscribe. If you know anybody who might be interested in a little pre-Socratic philosophy, make sure to share the video with them. But until next time, as always, God bless.